Hi, let's now start Module 7, Introduction to Renewable Energy Analytics, with first a discussion about forecast, why and in what form. Why forecasting? I think you've heard of forecasting since you were born. Forecasting seems to be something that has been around forever. Even in ancient tales, let's say from Greece, you hear of someone that would be consulted to tell about the future, and we would call it an oracle. Still today, forecasting is seen as a natural first step to decision making. For any type of decision making, it can be related to commercial activities, it might be related to some strategic industrial decisions, it might just be day-to-day life. How am I going to take an umbrella tomorrow when going to work? How am I going to get dressed? Believing we know what will happen, that's the essence of forecasting. It helps making decisions because we can plug this forecast into some decision-making processes, being an optimization problem, being a set of expert rules, but also, which is a more psychological aspect, forecast makes us more confident about the decisions we are making. Key application areas of forecasting that we are all aware of, that's weather and climate. All of us have seen a weather forecast one day. Lately, we're discussing a lot climate predictions. How is the climate going to develop in the future? Economics and finance is all about forecasting. What is going to be the growth at the country level in the coming quarter or in the coming year? What is going to be the unemployment rate? There are many variables that people care about. Then logistics. Think of it, people who take care of flows of goods. That can be shipping for a company like Maersk. That can be about buses, trains, whatever. All people involved in logistics will care about using forecast as input to decision making. And it's also the case for insurance. Actuaries, when having to think about pricing, about what could be handled through different type of insurance policies, they would like to have forecast about how to foresee the evolution of certain variables and how to adapt, for instance, the pricing, the risk premium to it. Zooming on energy aspects, we are going to discuss different type of forecasts, but also different type of users of this forecast. If you zoom on the various users that we are aware of, actually we'll realize that different actors have different needs. There are market participants, which we've heard of in the previous modules about participation in electricity market. On the supply side, there are the conventional generators. They may want to know about the market dynamics as a support to their offering strategies. There are wind farm operators also who will want to participate in the market and then need a certain type of forecast. Also on the demand side, the retailers will have similar needs as a basis for strategy making. Then you have participants in neighboring markets. They may want to know what's happening in a given area to know how this may affect their own area. Finally, market operators may have some need for forecasting like system operators. And part of this needs is actually a duty for transparency. They may have to publish some forecasts, for instance, for renewable energy over a whole area or over a whole country as a service to all the market participants. System operators may also want to do some forecasting to understand what's going to be the net load and its uncertainty and quantify the need for ancillary services that we have discussed before that. But then eventually also you and I may want to have forecasts for different type of variables, especially if we go towards a future with more decentralized energy system, more prosumers. If we have solar PV on our rooftop and a battery, we will become more active market players, and then all our decision making, even if automated, will use forecast as input, and you may want to understand what's going on, so you will look at the forecast yourself. Think of weather forecast. I think we've all been used to look at weather forecast. Even if we don't have to make any decision, we're just interested in knowing what could happen tomorrow, and depending on what's going to happen, maybe we're going to act, maybe we're just going to go through the day thinking, oh, it was a nice day, thank you very much. What do we want to forecast? There's a number of variables that are just obvious. People will want to predict. for electricity market participation or for management of the energy system. And traditionally, the variable that was the first and of most interest was the electric load. Since the load was seen as an inflexible demand that we should meet, we should know in advance, let's say a few hours ahead or a few days ahead, what will be the development of the electric load, and then we will adapt the generation side and the management of the power system to meet this electric load. So some of the first work about electric load forecasting can be traced back to 50 years ago. Then day-ahead prices. From the moment we've liberalized electricity markets and people could go freely to the market with their offering strategies and becoming more interested in the type of revenues they would get, the financial risks in the market, there has been an interest in day-ahead price forecasting. It's now been more than 20 years, maybe even 30 years in certain areas, that there's been this interest on day-ahead price forecasting due to the liberalization and the spread of this liberalization over a larger region like the whole Europe today. Then we have seen through the market participation strategy definition that we covered in the previous module that you may want to predict or understand what could be the potential imbalance sign for the system as a whole, since it would tell how the pricing is going to be for being in situation of up regulation or down regulation. And remember that in a two-price imbalance settlement, as we have in the Nord Pool, only one side will be penalizing while the other side is not. So if you want to know what is the right side, what is the wrong side, you will need to predict this potential imbalance sign. Then the regulation prices themselves, and then eventually the penalties as the spread between these regulation prices and the day-ahead price. Similarly, it will inform you on the slope of your loss functions, and it will then also tell you what could be the optimal quantile, for instance, you may want to offer in the market as a wind farm operator. Pushing a bit further, one may be interested in predicting the flows on the network, how the connection with neighboring market areas is going to work out in the following day, since, as you may remember from a previous module, if there is no congestion, the price in neighboring areas is going to be the same, but if there is congestion, then the prices will not be the same, and this can become strategic information, etc., etc. I could list a very long list of variables that one may be interested to predict, but we will focus on one that has become increasingly of focus. It's forecasting of the generation from renewable energy sources. You may think of wind power, you may think of solar power, but you may also think of wave energy. There also been an interest in predicting what would be the energy production from wave energy devices over the last 10-15 years. What is extremely interesting is that whatever these quantities you may want to predict, all of them are driven by weather and climate. So this motivates maybe developing a little flair in meteorology, in how meteorological variables may impact the energy system, and also this tells us that we should be aware about the development with the climate, since climate change or any type of climate development will necessarily impact these variables and the energy system as a whole. Renewable energy forecasts are today used in a lot of decision-making problems. Maybe the first decision-making problems that was of interest and strategic relevance for system operator was the definition of reserve requirements. When there were first significant deployments of wind farms, solar, PV on different systems, system operators got worried that they would not have enough reserves, so quantity of ancillary services, to face any potential situation in real time where the actual generation from these renewable generators would be very different from what was scheduled. Originally, even the rule in certain area would be that for 1 megawatt hour scheduled, we would just keep 1 megawatt of capacity as backup just to be sure. Obviously today this has evolved quite a lot. There are recommendations from ENSOE for how to quantify reserve depending on wind and solar PV generation and also the uncertainty in the load. And there are also quite a lot of research to define new ways to get these reserve requirements. Then the unit commitment and economic dispatch is a classical problem in power system operation and power system economics. And then when wind and solar or renewables in general appeared, one should think of how we should have these approaches to unit commitment and economic dispatch evolve to accommodate renewables and their characteristic. Obviously their forecast became an input. Storage is often seen as a natural companion to renewables, since renewable generation is viable and with limited predictability. Storage is ideal since you can smoothen the fluctuation and you can also compensate for forecast errors by discharging or charging the battery. So today, if you were to design coordination strategies for renewable storage, eventually you would need forecast to decide on how you would operate them together. Optimal trading strategies, we've discussed them in a previous module. I guess I don't need to convince you anymore that you will use forecast as input. Thinking of the market operator and more advanced type of market clearing, it is quite clear that these market operators may want to gather their own information about future renewables and especially forecast in order to improve the market clearing itself. Finally, optimal maintenance planning, especially for offshore wind farm, is something that requires forecast, and actually many forecasts, since you will want to have forecast of relevant weather variables. Think of going to an offshore wind farm. You will want to know what is going to be the wind speed there, the wave height, in case you can or cannot access the wind turbines. And then also you may want to have predictions for the production of the wind farm, this offshore wind farm, and predictions for prices in the market to find out when are the best periods to do the maintenance. Obviously, if the prices are very high and you're producing a lot from your wind farm, it may not be the best period for switching off everything and doing your maintenance. But another period with lower prices and very low power generation from your offshore wind farm might be a very good period to do your maintenance. In terms of inputs, the various types of forecasts we will discuss in further blocks are what we call deterministic forecast. So this will be single trajectory in the future. Then there are probabilistic forecasts, which we touched a little bit in a previous module. We will see that they can take the form of quantiles, intervals, and predictive distribution. They can be also a set of trajectories that we also call scenarios. So you want to have alternative possibilities for what could happen in the future. And then there may be risk indices that we'll see are more for broad audience applications, but that can be quite informative for some actors. Note that even though there are different types of forecasts and different actors may want to use certain forecasts depending on their knowledge, the tools they use, and their interest, but still at the end, we know that for nearly all of these problems, optimal decision can only be obtained if fully considering forecast uncertainty. So that means that even though most of the actors will use deterministic forecasts in practice, we know that the decision will be suboptimal compared to the case where they would use this probabilistic forecast. This suboptimality may be acceptable, it may not be acceptable. It's up to the forecast users and the decision makers to decide. We mentioned uncertainty estimation, and in principle you could think, okay, what is the problem with uncertainty estimation? We can just make some analysis from the past. We know how the forecast may be wrong, and we just assume this is what's going to happen tomorrow or for the next forecast. Actually, forecast uncertainty here for renewable power generation, since it comes from the weather and climate conditions, the uncertainty is very dynamic and very complex. So the uncertainty in wind speed, say, or wind power generation for tomorrow may be extremely high in, let's say, 12 hours, but then it could be much lower the day after. So it can change all the time, and it's very difficult to know that in advance. I have an example of representation of forecast uncertainty and the issue there may be in interpreting it based on what the French National Meteorological Office, Météo France, has been communicating for quite some time. These are confidence indices, or in French, indice de confiance. And these confidence indices have been associated with their forecast for maybe 25 years. Here is an example set of forecasts. So imagine you're on the Thursday of a given week, and you're given a forecast for the next 3 days so that you can plan your weekend. Maybe you want to go for some hiking activities, maybe you want to go to the beach, and you just look at the forecast to decide if you're going to go there. Besides this forecast, so this is the forecast for Friday, Saturday and Sunday, besides this forecast you have a number which is between 1 and 5. 1 is for low confidence and 5 is for high confidence. So the forecast for the Friday, which is the shortest lead time, is just tomorrow. The forecast is very nice, but then you get this number 2, which means we are not so confident about it. For the day after, we have a very mixed situation, though there's a mix between cloud, rain, sun, and some more clouds coming there. And we have an index of 4, which seems we're quite sure this is going to happen. And finally, for Sunday, we have a very mixed situation with clouds all over the place. There's a bit of rain here and there, and an index of 3, which means so-so. Maybe it's going to happen, maybe it's not going to happen. So what do you do with that? We have something that looks very clear, but we are told we're not very sure. We have something that is really mixed. It can be sunny or not, but we are very sure. And at the end, we have something that is just gray, blurry, rainy, and we are so sure. So at the end of the day, it might be quite difficult to use this uncertainty information, expressed this way at least, in a decision-making problem. For instance, if you were participating in the market, or here, if you were to decide to go to the beach or not that weekend, or for a hike. There's some other issue with the interpretation of information about forecast uncertainty. It may always be difficult to trust someone that provides you with the forecast. If you were to work with a forecaster for quite some time, I'm fairly sure you would analyze if this forecaster has been good in the recent past or not so good in the recent past, and you would project that into the future, and next time you get a forecast, you would decide if you trust this forecaster or not, depending on the recent performance. Here we say uncertainty is important, and so we want to have information about uncertainty, and eventually we want to have probabilistic information that would give a full picture about uncertainty. In the US, they have been used to provide uncertainty information or to have the forecast probabilistic for quite some time when it comes to the weather. And for instance, they would give you forecast about probability of precipitation. And here you have a certain threshold, so what's the probability that precipitation will be more than 25 millimeter? This is a map of the USA, and you see here the color range that tells you the probability, instead of being between 0 and 1, is between 0 and 100%, right? And so you have these areas with high probability of precipitation over that level, and you have some other areas. So for instance, let's look at New Orleans, the region of New Orleans, and it's said it's around 50% chance. So maybe it's going to happen, maybe it's not going to happen. How would you interpret that? Actually, some psychologists have made studies saying or showing that people, when giving this information, they would reflect back on the forecaster himself, and say, well, it doesn't seem that the forecaster knows what he's doing because he says he's not sure if it's going to happen. There are also some people who were having some far-fetched interpretation of the information. So they would say, oh, 50-50, so it means it's going to rain 50% of the time. So if you look over a period of 1 day, it would rain half of the day. Some people would say it would rain 50% of the area considered. So if I look at one state in the US, for instance, half of the state would receive some rain and the other half would not receive any rain. So eventually, there is a risk that if you have two forecasters, with one forecaster that deliver a deterministic message, but maybe it's wrong, and then another forecaster that gives you a probabilistic message, which might be quite more correct under a certain criteria, But at the end of the day, as a forecast user, you will prefer to trust forecaster A just because it sounds right. And that's what we coined the big mouth paradox. You might prefer to hear something that is loud and clear instead of a message that is more probabilistic, uncertain, and that may feel a bit fluffy. So here in this case, I think if you were to make a poll, who would you hire? You will realize in practice, most people would hire forecaster A, who is deterministic, even though it might not be so good. If you are interested in these studies about the impact of the forecast format and appraisal of people of the type of forecast, you may read these papers by clicking on the links that are provided in the slides. Eventually, let's look at how the forecast used in various types of decision-making problems may perform, so how they may bring value to the forecast user. For that, I think it's quite simpler to focus on the same problem as in the previous module, and so we'll focus on market participation. A paper that was mentioned in this previous module on trading focused on the Dutch electricity market over the year 2002 with the day-ahead market APX and the regulation mechanism managed by TNET, the TSO for the Netherlands. There, we considered the participation of 15 megawatt wind farm without any storage and without any control of the power production. Points and probabilistic prediction, so deterministic forecast and probabilistic forecast, as mentioned in the previous module, were used with state-of-the-art statistical methods to generate them, and then focus were given to different types of revenue maximization strategies. Let's trust the forecast, and then let's use probabilistic forecast with a model of the asymmetry of penalties in the market. Eventually, when looking at the results, so we have here results with a naive forecasting method, we have results for a state-of-the-art point forecasting method, so with deterministic information. Then we have results from using a state-of-the-art probabilistic forecasting method, and then the stochastic optimization strategy, the news vendor problem we discussed in a previous module. And this would be the results with perfect prediction, yielding this performance ratio of 100, which we also discussed previously. When comparing these different type of methods, maybe the most important line here in this table, which you could look into more detail if you want, but the most important lines would be the performance ratio, the average energy price that is received by using these different trading strategies, and then the total revenue if you were to compare these different values that are received by the same wind farm if they are using different strategies for market participation. So one can see that the revenues can vary quite a lot depending on which forecasting method is used and how these forecasts are used in decision making. From the performance ratio of 100, we see that the performance ratio would drop to 79% if using a naive point forecasting approach. It would go up to 87% if using a more advanced point prediction approach, but we are still in the deterministic framework. And then if going probabilistic and using stochastic optimization over long periods, as is done here, one would get quite higher revenue. Let's zoom in a bit more and then look at the part of imbalance. So that means that's the share of energy that is exposed to the balancing mechanism and for which you would have to pay the balancing price for the imbalance settlement. We discussed with the two-price imbalance settlement system, maybe what's good is to be on the right side. It's not obviously to get the lowest imbalance volume. And this is something we can verify here. You can see using a naive forecasting method, the share of imbalance is very high. So 74% of the produced energy will eventually be settled through the imbalance mechanism. If we use a more advanced forecasting method, obviously the forecast errors are lower, so we expect to have lower imbalances to settle. And here, yes, indeed, it's almost divided by 2. We go down to 40%. When we go probabilistic, the performance ratio increases to 92%, but we actually see that the volume of imbalance increases from 40 to 55%. And what's happening there is what I mentioned earlier. That means you know how to place yourself on the right side, but you don't try to minimize your imbalance. You try to minimize the cost from having an imbalance. And if you're on the right side, you know that this cost is going to be much lower. So you're trying to navigate, but you're not trying to minimize your imbalance. Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite you to use the self-assessment quiz to check your understanding.